New receiving weapons in new places. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter, Stealing Signals, at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work at RotoViz. Shawn was in a couple pods already this week. We talked through all of the impactful running backs in our first show, several of the impactful quarterback shifts, a pretty big focus on Kirk Cousins to Atlanta and what that will mean. But some of the other smaller moves, Sam Darnold to Minnesota, some of those things in the second episode. Today, we want to focus on the pass catchers that are changing places. We did already hit on like Darnell Mooney to Atlanta. When we talked about Atlanta, it's obviously these things are combined. And part of the reason we pushed one of the quarterbacks, Russell Wilson, to this episode is because of how that ties into the Deontay Johnson trade to Carolina and getting into all of those topics. And that's probably where we will start here today, but we want to talk through the pass catchers. Not as many names have shifted. A lot of the biggest ones that were potentially free agents ended up staying home, which makes sense because these teams want to retain, the high-end pass catcher. Mike Evans is staying in Tampa. Michael Pittman is staying in Indianapolis, etc. So the big one, the key one, obviously, Deontay Johnson getting traded. We have Gabe Davis to Jacksonville to hit on. Jerry Jeudy gets traded to the Browns. Some tight ends moving around, not as many big names, but some interesting stuff for those teams and their outlooks, and we will dig into those. But, Shawn, we teased Russell Wilson a little bit on yesterday's show, and certainly him landing to Pittsburgh, I mentioned a little on yesterday's show. I liked the fit for him. I think with Arthur Smith, with a running mindset offensively, that it seems like Pittsburgh is certainly going to head that direction. That was decent for Russ. One of the sort of more disingenuous stats that I've seen a couple of times this offseason is comparing Russ's per attempt efficiency to Patrick Mahomes's and saying that he compares favorably, which there's such a for people who aren't watching on YouTube, Shawn's face as he heard that, because he doesn't spend a lot of time on Twitter, was priceless. It was a look at me like, wait, people are doing that? And it's actually pretty close in terms of some of the per attempt efficiency on the pass attempts. What it omits is everything else that's very important. Number one, how defenses are playing them. Number two, the volume, the fact that Mahomes is asked to throw into pass defenses, run looks, right? But they still throw, and that's part of why he takes some of these checkdowns. His ADOT was a little lower this year, some of that stuff, because they trust him in a way that a lot of offenses don't trust their quarterback to not push the ball into bad looks, to take the safe throw, to go underneath when he has to. I thought he played a different brand of football, but some really good football. And the fact that he dropped back as much as he did, which is like over 100 times more than Russ, is itself indicative of how good he was. But if you look at it in just a per attempt basis, then you can kind of cover that up a little bit. Whereas the Broncos were essentially running their whole offense through their running backs and hiding Russell Wilson as much as they could. The third thing I'll also mention about that comparison that drives me a little nuts is sacks. Patrick Mahomes doesn't take a whole lot of them. Russell Wilson runs into pressure and takes a lot of sacks and doesn't get the attempts off. And those are drive killers. Those are essentially turnovers, except they don't happen in the passing game, so they don't show up on the per attempt passing stats. So anyway, that was a stat that floated around multiple times. What are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I mentioned
Russell Wilson's as good as Patrick Mahomes, is what I'm saying.
I had mentioned that I had looked up some third down stats in the previous show, specifically related to Russell Wilson. And then it was interesting, just how well Kirk Cousins played on some of those downs last year. But you have a situation where Russell Wilson is going to a team that the most noteworthy or the most, arguably notorious thing about their offense over the recent seasons is this epic streak of, then I believe it's both 300-yard passing games and 400 yards of total offense, in that they were never hitting that. Right. And you finally break some of those at the end of the season. My understanding was that at one point last year, the Broncos had some insane number, either a streak or a total number of 3 and outs. I was looking for that. I couldn't find it. Maybe a listener has that stat for us.
Across multiple games, yeah.
But when you're looking at these 3rd and 5 or more attempts, Russell Wilson's adjusted net yards per attempt last year, it's actually vaguely middle of the package, but it's below guys like Geno Smith, who we mentioned in the previous show, had a terrible season. It's below Desmond Ridder, who's not going to start any more games in the NFL, at least intentionally, right? It's below Aiden O'Connell, who, flashed at times, but, you're talking about a late round rookie in a bad offense. Okay. The other thing that's vaguely interesting there, and this is a bit of double counting, as obviously sacks are included in the adjusted net yards per attempt, or, it's mentioning the same basic stat twice, but essentially what you said, which is that the sack numbers are excruciating. And one of the things that Sam Howell was justifiably hammered on is those sack percentages, especially in crucial moments. Russell Wilson's sack percentage on 3rd and 5 or more was virtually identical. And by that, I mean 16.5 for him, 16.5 for Zach Wilson, 16.7 for Sam Howell. You're talking about, again, guys who on the key plays, they're just getting sacked. They're destroying these drives. And when you throw those considerations in with this issue that Russell Wilson has at throwing over the middle, and one of the things that you were mentioning to me, throwing the intermediate level targets, he's just very limited in terms of, number one, he's got a huge weakness. And then number two, he's very limited in the types of routes and plays that he can run as a now more limited scrambling quarterback in his mid-30s.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, if you watch the Broncos, that's what happened last year. They weren't, I think Sean Payton made up his mind on Russell Wilson potentially before the season, but certainly in season at some point, and I think pretty early in the season. And it was funny when not funny, but I appreciated a couple of our listeners writing some nice, messages and tweets after Russell Wilson got cut that were basically saying, we've been talking about this on Stealing Bananas for like 18 months now, because it was clear in 2022 that the Russell Wilson trade was not going to work. And then especially after Sean Payton was hired, we talked a lot about this. He was not going to want to guarantee the 2025 salary. They were already kind of screwed, Denver, for the 2024 season in terms of the dead money they had to eat. And when Russ was inevitably cut before his 2025 salary was due to become fully guaranteed, $37 million they would have had to commit to him if they still had him on the roster on the 5th day of the league year this year, which is 5 days from now. We're recording this on the first day of the league year. So they were inevitably going to cut him before this point. Somebody sent me a tweet from the late part of 2022 where I was saying, the Broncos need to spend the 2023 offseason planning ahead for when they take that dead money cut in 2024. And so anyway, this is something we've talked a lot about. And obviously, Sean, even before then, when we go all the way back to the Broncos acquiring him, you were one of the people that was most adamant that Seattle was going to win that trade, and it looks like one of the biggest wins you've ever seen in a trade, ultimately, in the way that it impacted Denver and has set them back, certainly. But anyway, Peyton, I think if you watch them during the season last year, that decision was made. He was not going to be on this roster in 2024. They were certainly not going to guarantee the $37 million for 2025, which meant he had to be cut. And they basically just played out the string. They benched him at the end of the year, right? Even though his production was decent and there was all this talk about, well, they shouldn't be benching him, but they didn't want to play him, right? And so they were very run heavy at times when they shouldn't have been, trying to win very low scoring games. The stat that I mentioned was actually, I did a guest appearance with the CBS guys, and I always love getting a chance to talk with them again. And Dave Richard brought up a great stat where I don't have the exact numbers, but Russ was I think 29th in pass attempts that were to the intermediate depths, I think between 10 and 20 yards. And he was much higher in the deeper areas and the shallower areas. He was basically a sandwich. He would either throw short or deep. And there was a lot of those short passes that we see from the Sean Payton offenses. And then they would take shots to keep defenses honest. And Russ wasn't particularly great at those shots, but they did hit on some. Cortland Sutton had a decent season as it was as it played out, he was pretty efficient on all of that. As I was thinking about that stat when I saw Benjamin Solak, who I mentioned on the show sometimes from The Ringer, who I want to give a shout out to. He does these little clips on Twitter. And Shawn, you're the smart person that's not on Twitter, but I'm talking to the audience that doom scrolls like me. I think one of the biggest compliments that you can give somebody on like social media is that when you see their post, you actually want to stop and read it. And when he does these little clips, these little videos, I always want to stop and watch him because he has such a strong understanding of schematic stuff. And I always learn something from watching his little clips. He broke down a Russell Wilson play where he had a clean pocket. They brought some pressure. And Jerry Jeudy is like, if they're bringing pressure, I think it was in the Patriots game, if they're bringing pressure, Jerry Judy's running a shallow cross, like an intermediate crossing route, but he's going to be the first look because he's running a short enough route, and that's where the ball is going to need to go. And he's open and he wins on his route, and there's nobody else dropping into his passing lane, and Russ has a clean pocket, and he turns around and runs backwards and like runs into pressure and takes a sack. And Benjamin even points out how if he doesn't like the Jeudy throw for whatever reason, or he misses that window, there's a second route that releases in the underneath range from a tight end crossing the field that could have been there as well. And he had a clean enough pocket that the Broncos picked up the blitz and the Broncos picked up the blitz. The Patriots didn't have enough numbers on the back end. It had to be a completion to the intermediate depth was the key point. And that Russ just doesn't have that. He doesn't have that pocket comfortability anymore, especially at this stage. He never really did. He was always somebody who tried to extend these plays and things like that. But when I saw that he signed with the Steelers, my immediate thought, Shawn, was how bad it was for Deontay Johnson, who has been a guy who was graded really well in all the separation metrics, had strong targets per out run every year. It's been a little weaker the last couple seasons. Really high targets per out run earlier, really high targets per out run at Toledo in his college years. Definitely somebody that gets open and draws targets. It's undeniable. The issue with Deontay Johnson for a long time was efficiency. Last year, his efficiency rebounded to a pretty reasonable range. His yards per target, like this after the target efficiency, was, I believe, like 8.3 or something, which typically he's in the like sixes, which is bad. But he was back to a pretty reasonable range, which was a huge upgrade for him. Some of that was because his ADOT was a career high, up over 12. They were getting a little more vertical with him. He still didn't thrive necessarily last year, but it was one of his best seasons. He's really gotten rid of some of the drops issues and those things. And so I'm mildly intrigued by him. I was frustrated with the fit for him. Is definitely, you can talk a little bit about Pickens and the Cortland Sutton mold and these deep shots I was just talking about with Russell Wilson. But if Russell Wilson's not going to pull a trigger in the intermediate ranges and be able to get the ball to Deontay Johnson when he wins on routes, that's going to be a problem. And so I was really excited to see that trade as well, because I don't know that it's a huge win for Deontay Johnson. We also need to talk about Bryce Young on this show. And they had nobody last year, Shawn. We identified this early in the offseason that Carolina's pass receiving core was one of the worst constructed ones I can remember, and certainly the worst in the league going into the year. We saw how that played out. It basically was nobody earning any volume or doing anything productive, and then a lot of underneath throws to Adam Thielen as a result, who was good, very good, earned a lot of volume because of, in my opinion, largely because of the huge lack of competition and the need for targets to go somewhere. But even within that context, Bryce Young didn't necessarily play well. He didn't elevate anything. But getting him Deontay Johnson is like, that's exactly what he needed. Somebody who can consistently get open, because he didn't have that last year, and allow him somewhere to throw the ball. And we can see if that can help his development in year two. If there's any hope for him, and I don't want to write off a player after one season, that's the first step, is Carolina start to get him some receivers that can get open down the field consistently. So anyway, I think Deontay Johnson moving on from Pittsburgh, he was not a good fit with Russ. I saw a lot of people say that after he got traded that, like, well, now the Steelers have a need for a Deontay Johnson type. And I don't know why you would, if Russell Wilson's your quarterback. I mean, I think you want George Pickens and Arthur Smith's your coordinator. I mean, do your run game and throw downfield to George Pickens. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. You have Pat Freiermuth, I guess. You can use him in the intermediate ranges and those things. But sorry, I threw a ton of stuff at you there, but a lot of interesting happenings with the Russ signing in Pittsburgh, with Deontay moving to Carolina. There are a lot of moving parts there. Not real huge reasons for optimism in either offense. These are not offenses that I want to be heavily exposed to going into 2024. One of the offenses is coordinated by Arthur Smith. You guys know that I don't want anything to do with Arthur Smith offenses, generally speaking, but some intriguing fits at least. It's not the worst possible situation.
And Deontay Johnson is somebody who, I mean, you mentioned all those target per route numbers, and just the raw targets have been absolutely massive through big chunks of his career. And now he goes into a situation that Adam Thielen was able to make work. Now, I mean, there's a huge, I wouldn't say risk, but just the ceiling is probably not particularly high. But Deontay Johnson is wide receiver 43. I've been in a lot of drafts already this year where I'm like, I can't believe I would click on a guy who's going to have a bad quarterback and is going to have Arthur Smith as the coordinator. But Deontay Johnson at wide receiver 43 is absurd. And if you need to get wide receiver depth in these best ball formats, which almost always you do, I think it's a viable play. I'm glad that I have those selections, because I think that now, again, with Bryce Young, who was apocalyptically bad as a rookie, but did have some big positives in his profile. He was the number one overall pick. We know he's going to get some chances to try and make that work. And I do think the uncertain element of, can he bounce back? I mean, usually when quarterbacks have that poor rookie season, even when they were good prospects, they do not. But I think that's fun for him. I'm going to have some Deontay Johnson. One of the things that I didn't mention previously, but meant to, is that one of these guys that Russell Wilson finished way below last year on these third down situations was Kenny Pickett, who averaged, 1.5 yards more in terms of adjusted net yards per attempt on these third downs. Now, one of the big problems for him is that touchdown percentage is just very, very low. And so if part of what you're doing is just avoiding any risk and not moving the ball, we often contrast these guys, and that was one of the sort of themes of our previous show as well. These players who have the ability to move the ball and those who don't, you're going to have to live with some things and some decisions from Ryan Fitzpatrick that you don't have to live with from quarterbacks who just throw the ball away and punt. So I'm not in any way saying that Kenny Pickett was the answer. They should have stuck there. But I mean, the contrast when you're looking at his ability to avoid some of these sacks, his sack percentage on those types of downs was extremely low. So again, it depends on what your objectives are. As we're talking about wide receivers and we're talking about Russell Wilson and the damage that he could have potentially done to Deontay Johnson, it wasn't going to be a situation where if he stays in Denver, he does that damage to, number one, he wasn't going to stay in Denver, but then number two, Jerry Jeudy didn't stay in Denver either, right? He was allowed to escape that situation regardless. You go to the Cleveland Browns, you now have to deal with Deshaun Watson, who is arguably having some similar types of problems just earlier in his overall trajectory. Anytime that you have off the field instances that take you out for a long period of time, I think that you have some concerns that that age trajectory is going to be moved way up, or just that you never come back properly. But Jerry Jeudy is somebody who has played poorly enough and played so, catastrophically bad in 2023 that I think that his price, almost regardless of where he ended up, his price down at wide receiver 59, I'm not even necessarily suggesting that drafters should make a point of going out and getting him or using him as a means to, again, build that receiver depth. But it blows my mind. I knew this, and I've written about this in the past for Jeudy in terms of what could potentially happen if he ever got decent quarterback play, if he got a good coordinator. And one of the reasons why I was enthusiastic about a potential jump in 2023 was Sean Payton. Then Jerry Jeudy's targets as an NFL player have come 162 with Russell Wilson after he was completely washed up and a bad fit for Jeudy, 106 from Drew Lock, You have 30 from Brett Rippon. You have 13 from Jared Stidham. You have 12 from Jeff Driscoll. You have 46 from Teddy Bridgewater. I mean, Deshaun Watson is not good anymore, but Jerry Jeudy is going to be looking at that and saying, I mean, this is Christmas early in the year. Knowing that Jeudy has had an interesting and mixed profile in the past, is there any enthusiasm for either him and or these other Broncos receivers, simply knowing that they're not going to have Russell Wilson? Now, for Jerry Jeudy, Deshaun Watson, for the Broncos, as we discussed in the previous show, that's wide open what they're going to go into 2024 with.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that I'm definitely interested in the Broncos left behind, in Sutton, who had a good year. And I think now if you look at his profile overall, he had some good seasons earlier. He obviously dealt with the ACL. But I think when you look at him in a big picture, I think we have a pretty good idea that Courtland Sutton's an above average wide receiver at the NFL. Like he had a good, interesting profile coming out of college as well. I think that guy's good. Marvin Mims obviously was the immediate one that people were excited about. There was a quote from Peyton, I believe, from the combine or bouncing around somewhere. Maybe it was around the Super Bowl. I can't remember exactly when, but he was asked about Mims, and it was before the trade of Jerry Jeudy, and he referenced that it was really their fault that Mims didn't play more, and it was in part because Mims played sort of the same position as Jeudy, and it was the guys that were there, but they were looking forward to Mims playing more in year two. And then when you hear that quote and then you see the Jerry Jeudy trade not long after, you're like, okay, I mean, he meant that. I mean, they were playing Jeudy, and then they intend to, move forward with Marvin Mims as their second round pick that they really liked and made a point to draft. So both of those guys, I think, are intriguing in terms of what might happen in Denver. We're not entirely sure. I would say I'm less interested, obviously all relative to cost, but I'm pretty out on Jerry Jeudy at this point. I mean, you made a good case for the reasons to be fair to his situations and the context that's been there and the quarterbacks he's had to play with. And I think it's everything I just was talking about with Russell Wilson in the intermediate range and how it would have been horrible for Deontay Johnson. Jerry Jeudy is that player, as you noted, in the offense last year that took the brunt of that. But for me, it's the stuff you said about Cleveland. It's Deshaun Watson has not looked good. In addition to that, Amari Cooper did just have a career high yards per route run and is still playing at a pretty strong level. David Njoku also just put up career high numbers in several categories, targets per out run, yards per out run included. You're talking about a crowded situation. They also brought in Elijah Moore, who didn't necessarily, he didn't have a good year. He didn't really fit cleanly with the Browns last year, but might fit better in year two or what have you. I think it becomes a really crowded passing game in Cleveland, where they still do want to run the ball a decent amount. We'll see where Nick Chubb's health is at and all of those things. But a lot of times with the crowded situations, we've talked about that being an opportunity and a place to target because of the ways that things can consolidate and all of that. But I think that's what's key about that is when you feel really good about the skill level of all the players. Talk about like the Niners, like those top four guys on the Niners, at their skill positions, CMC, Ayuk, Debo, and Kittle are also good. And you really expect if one of them misses time, that the other three are going to consolidate all that work. And even if two of them miss time, that the other two are going to be the dominant players in the offense because they're all superstars, essentially. I don't know that the Brown situation is that similar. I don't know that I trust their passing game after what I saw from Watson this past year. And frankly, everything we've seen from Watson since he returned. I guess I don't really know where the upside is for Jeudy. In most scenarios, if they stay healthy, that there's not enough opportunity. If an Amari Cooper does get hurt, does that mean that Jeudy even necessarily consolidates all of that work and ascends? The overall profile to me is difficult, even at a really palatable price.
And I think the one thing that is interesting here is that so much of what Sutton did do relative to Judy was with the touchdowns. And, you can fade that if you want, but Blair has a lot of research suggesting that you want to embrace it instead. But I know that you had some notes on some of these additional interesting receiver signings, specifically Gabe Davis and his fit with the Jacksonville Jaguars, and how that might be superior to really what we got from Calvin Ridley, even though Ridley, despite the absence for a while there, being the much bigger name.
Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't make the case that Davis is better than Ridley. I think a lot of people were saying, well, they cut Gabe Davis to replace Calvin Ridley. That's horrible. And I mean, it's not a certainty that Ridley wouldn't re-sign potentially still. I've seen some discussions of the ways that Gabe and Ridley could fit together as the outside receivers. And then you have, Kirk in the slot, and you have Evan Ingram in the slot or as a tight end or what have you. And it could still potentially work. It kind of would push Zay Jones out of the equation. But I suspect the money they gave to Davis suggests that Ridley won't necessarily be back. And I'm not directly comparing them. I guess what I wrote on Twitter, I didn't think that Gabe Davis was really a replacement for Ridley in a direct sense. I think from a scheme perspective, the best version of this offense was late in 2022, and that Gabe Davis is a more clean replacement for the Marvin Jones / good things Zay Jones was doing down the stretch in 2022, deep threat player that was field stretching and then allowing the underneath passing for Kirk, for Evan Ingram. We talk about like complementary profiles, and I like to like a lot of people talk about like the X position and the flanker position, the slot positions, all of these things. I think that stuff's interesting, but when you think about like passing games and football, there are a lot of different types of schemes. There are a lot of different types of formations that can be run, multiple tight ends, etc. I still think the best way to think about the ways that receivers fit together is not what position they will play within a scheme, because you can draw up different formations. You can draw up different alignments. Obviously, I know that stuff is important. There are people that do a lot of work on that. I just don't think it's the most important thing, because you can do, I mean, some of the best stuff I've seen in formational stuff has been about how like McVay and some of these offenses are shrinking the receiver split, so they're a lot closer to the line of scrimmage and they have more room to work on like out breaking patterns. And so they're doing like 2x2s, but both receivers are kind of stacked in closer, and you're not. My point just being, traditionally you always had a wide receiver out on the boundary on both sides in a lot of these old school formations. But there are intelligent coaches that will just change the alignment, or they'll use motion to change the alignment, or what have you. My point is, when you think about the ways that receivers fit together, I still like to think about it in terms of the depths that they're effective at, because regardless of their formation, regardless of the exact routes that they're going to run and how those routes interconnect, when you draw up a play, you need to create space on the field. And the number one way to create space is to have guys that can attack down the field. Then you stretch that passing zone vertically. You send the safeties back. You force room then in the intermediate and shallow ranges. When you can't press vertically and you get into like that, early Justin Fields career, Chicago Bears, Matt Nagy offense, where their offensive line was so bad that they would just run like 5 curls and everyone knew they were running curls. You're not stretching anything vertically. Defenses are pressing down and everything is in the same space. So you can't just spread out horizontally. You need to be able to spread the field vertically to create all the space to attack, to have your route combinations attack different areas. Like fundamentally, not getting to the point of how those actual plays are going to be developed, which I think a lot of people focus, again, really heavily on what the X alignment was and how that, whether you have the X receiver attack or you have the tight end attack up the seam, or you have a slot guy run a slot fade. Like, you need to be able to attack vertically to press the safeties back. And it can be different spots on the field that attack vertically. You can have the running back run a wheel up the sideline. It's not going to have the same effect necessarily as holding the safeties because he's coming out of the backfield. But the point I'm trying to make, I still think it's about the depths. And the one thing Gabe Davis does well, this is not about Gabe Davis going to be a huge, massive fantasy football piece in Jacksonville necessarily. But the one thing he does do well is he is a receiver that threatens down the field. And when you don't respect that, he can put up numbers. He does have explosive games. We talk about him being inconsistent for fantasy, but what I think that means on a schematic level is teams not respecting him as the downfield weapon because he hasn't played well enough for the last month, and they're watching film and they don't put enough of an emphasis on Gabe Davis. And when a team does that or has done that, the Bills have been able to take advantage at times because he is efficient per target in those types of things. His targets per out run have fallen multiple years in a row now. He doesn't earn a lot of volume. Some of that is defenses running these cover two shells that we're talking about. They take away Gabe Davis type players now in the NFL, right? Mike Williams and those guys have struggled as well. You have these guys that are really good at that. They're maybe just in, compared to modern defenses, just decoys a lot of the time as a result. So he hasn't been able to earn a lot of volume, but when he gets targets, and this is something that he tweeted out, or had his publicists were talking about it, since like 2020, Gabe Davis has been one of the top receivers in the NFL in yards per target and touchdowns per target, all of that stuff. The target part is important. He doesn't, earn enough volume, but when he gets the targets, he has been an efficient receiver, and he was productive as a college player. He was a late round guy that we thought had an interesting profile because of his efficiency in college. He has shown an ability to hurt you as a defense if you don't respect him. And so in that regard, I think he is a really interesting piece for Jacksonville's scheme in a way that some of the criticisms I heard of Calvin Ridley this past year from those people that look at more advanced stuff than what I'm talking about receiver play is that he couldn't get off of jams. He couldn't get down. He couldn't press defenses vertically. And so maybe he wasn't as good of a fit because he needs to be somebody who works in more in the intermediate range and things like that, or he needs the free releases. He doesn't have to have the press coverage, so he can move into the slot and some of those things. I don't know all the exact stuff on Ridley, but I do think it's fair to say that even if Gabe Davis isn't a better receiver than Ridley, that he's probably better at threatening defenses deep. And we know that, look, I mean, this guy had a 4-touchdown game in the playoffs. He's had other monster games when forgotten about deep, and when the balls go to him, he makes the catches down the field. He can at least do that part of it for you and score touchdowns, etc. A lot of that goes to Josh Allen, but Trevor Lawrence also likes to push the ball downfield and threaten, and he's not just taking checkdowns every time. So there is schematically the defenses are going to have to respect Gabe Davis to a degree. I think of all the places he could land, this is a good one for him. I don't think this means that he's, again, somebody that I'm going to have a lot of, but I do think within that context that when he gets those opportunities downfield, he could have some splash games and he could be an interesting best ball piece. But I got higher on Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram as a result of this signing, because I think what Gabe Davis does for them is opens them up to be target dominant players underneath. And it also potentially opens up Trevor Lawrence to, rather than having this number one receiver he felt like he needed to feed at times. The Calvin Ridley thing didn't always work. It felt like sometimes he needed to feed him. It felt like other times they were like intentionally going away from him, or defenses were maybe giving him a lot of respect and double teaming or what have you. Lawrence seemed to be at his best in 2022 when it was like the ball can go anywhere. He's gonna read where the defense allows him to throw the ball. I think that's a little bit of a limitation. I've come to the understanding of the really great quarterbacks, when they have great players, know they have their man beater out there or what have you. I mean, we know like Aaron Rodgers is a great example of that throughout his career. Devonta Adams, Jordy Nelson, go back to Greg Jennings. Tom Brady did it with Randy Moss, Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne and all those guys in Peyton Manning's career. And then even with the Broncos late, Demaryius Thomas and all those guys. When quarterbacks are able to see certain formational stuff and often probably man coverage, they go to the guys that they know can win and that kind of thing. But there are quarterbacks that are successful just basically by taking what the defense gives them and spreading the ball around, and they don't necessarily have one go-to guy necessarily. That's what it felt like Trevor Lawrence was when at his best at this stage of his career in this version of his offense in 2022. Kirk was thriving. Ingram had a really good run late in the year and had some splash games. Zay Jones had some splash games. It could have been anyone at any time. I think last year, a little bit more, he was trying to get the ball to that guy in Calvin Ridley, and maybe Calvin Ridley just wasn't good enough to be that guy, but it didn't work as well. Now they have these complementary pieces again. I think Gabe Davis is actually an upgrade on Marvin Jones, right, from 2 years ago, and can win down the field in those ways. And it allows Kirk and Ingram to do what they do really well and not have any real overlap with Ridley like I think they did a little bit last year. And it allows Lawrence to sort of focus on, okay, I'm going to read and distribute to whoever's open and whatever the defense is giving me. I think it's a really intriguing fit. I really like it. It has me more excited, not just about Kirk and Ingram, but about the Jacksonville offense to be a rebound team. This is an offense people were really high on last year, and we weren't quite as much last year, coming off a really strong end of the 2022. Very disappointing relative to expectations in 2023 for this team. They were, I think, like minus 180 to win their division, and then Houston ends up, winning the division. They have a really disappointing 2023 season. Gabe Davis isn't like a massive signing, and that's why I'm spending so much time on this, because I feel the need to qualify a lot of my statements, but I think he's a good one and improves their odds to rebound in 2024.
But you're defending our decision to include Gabe Davis in the show.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I think that those are interesting points and good points in terms of the fit and how, even if it seems extremely strange to say that replacing a Calvin Ridley with a Gabe Davis could actually make the offense work, I think the numbers support that really well. You look at Calvin Ridley and where he was last year, and almost 86% route percentage. Gabe Davis only at 77% with the Bills. The targets per route, 22% for Ridley, only 16% for Gabe Davis. And so, superficially, what you're saying is, well, Davis is more of a role player. But to your point, I think that's exactly what the Jaguars need. And the emphasis on total routes and targets to Ridley didn't work. And one of the ways that you can see that is that, Gabe Davis averaged 2 more yards per target than Ridley did. Now, 2 completely separate offenses, but if you're throwing a guy into this mix and saying what we want is more efficiency and for the quarterback not to feel like he has to go to the alpha, which is certainly the way that it looked when you're watching them play. One of the other things here is that, I don't know for sure how much Ridley was able to challenge defenses deep or not. He had a lot of air yards per route. He had a lot of total air yards. They, threw those passes out there. And one of the things that Lawrence and Ridley have said as they work through this, and by the time you're listening to this, Ridley, maybe back with the Jaguars, or he may be on a different team. But, they've said we were so close on a lot of plays. And Ridley's on-target catch percentage last year was poor. Right now, Gabe Davis's wasn't that great either. It's perhaps one of the reasons why you can have 5 games with 20-plus points and 5 with 0. That's one of the most insane lines you'll ever run across for fantasy football. It's obviously fine for best ball. It's infuriating in other situations. But you had him on one of your best teams. And one of the crazy notes that you had given me on that was just that those 20-point games were almost always followed up by a really poor game. And I was looking at it here. It's only once did he score more than 5.1 points in a game after the 20-point game, including, again, some of those zeros. But when you look at it, as you just did within the context, this is a season in a team where Christian Kirk averaged a half yard more per route, but only ran 75% of the routes last year. Doug Peterson struggled. His run game design for Travis Etienne was atrocious, but also what he was asking Trevor Lawrence to do. You watch these games similar to watching the Eagles games, and the lack of creativity compared to the innovative play callers, the innovative offenses, it was so striking as you're running into the line and then you're throwing these vertical passes that, are prayer types of plays. That's not what you're looking for. I think for the exact reasons you said, they could get back to what they did so effectively in 2022 with the structure of their offense this coming year. And to close, you wanted to make a case for Zach Ertz.
Yeah, we had a couple, a little bit of tight end movement. We'll just mention some of it quickly. I think Zach Ertz is, I told you, annoyingly in the late round discussion now, he lands in Washington. They immediately cut Logan Thomas, which I think tells you that they intend to use Zach Ertz and view him as somebody capable of running a good number of routes and kind of being their lead tight end. The other key thing is Cliff Kingsbury is there. He was the coach in Arizona when they traded for Zach Ertz. The timeline was a little fuzzy for both of us. I went back and checked. He was also the coach there for the entire next season for Zach Ertz, which was 2022. And then for 11 games in 2021. Ertz only played 10 games in 2022, but he plays 21 total games under Kingsbury. And that's that stretch in Arizona where Ertz got a lot of volume. He got I think it was 150 targets, caught 100 balls when I was adding it up. Again, 21 games, a little bit longer than a normal season. Washington as a location, Jahan Dotson really struggled to earn volume this season. I think Curtis Samuel is Curtis Samuel a free agent, but had a pretty solid season. He might be back. We'll see what happens. Terry McLaurin, never been a target dominant alpha. He's never really been even better than 21% targets per out run type. He's good, but he's just never been that elite player. And again, Dotson, it's part of the reason that I'm frustrated with Dotson's season so much because he wasn't dealing with a target dominant number one and still had a really poor targets per out run season. So they have these are guys that have been efficient per target and stuff, similar to how we were describing Gabe Davis. They have an intriguing receiving core, but they do also have the ability for targets to go somewhere. You have a rookie quarterback, presumably playing most of the season in 2024. It's just going to be a bunch of 5-yard turnaround stop routes from Zach Ertz. Defenses aren't going to want to stop that. That was part of the thing with Adam Thielen that I wrote about in Stealing Signals was defenses don't need to take this away. They don't care about these 2-yard turnaround curls that Thielen ran a lot of. Ertz, same thing. And that's part of the reason he got so many targets in Arizona. Defenses weren't fine, have that pass. We're going to worry about the stuff that you're doing down the field. It's annoying. And they're not going to be efficient targets, but he's going to get a lot of targets this year. He's going to catch a decent number of passes. And as far as late round tight ends and whatever your build is, he could provide some late round tight end stability. I think you still want to be targeting upside wherever you can in all these situations. But as far as, the late round tight ends go, there's a couple other intriguing ones, Sean. Jonnu Smith goes to Miami. I do think that's tricky with the way that they get so concentrated with the volume to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. People are down on Waddle. When I wrote up the targets per out run thing, it's impressive how good he was behind Tyreek Hill, who had monster targets per out run numbers. So when you're talking about the opposite of what I just said with Jahan Dotson, when the number one's getting 35% of his routes he's getting targeted on, and Waddle's still at 27%, that's a good year. And in the one game that Tyreek Hill missed, he had a 9-target, 8-catch, 140-yard game. Waddle, somebody that
should be having that nightmare about Jalen Waddle.
You should be having that nightmare about Jalen Waddle, whose value has dropped now. The clearest contingency-based case I think you can make in the whole NFL, where that's the point I'm making about the game that Tyreek Hill missed, is if Tyreek Hill were to be out for extended time, the way that this offense is so concentrated with their volume and Mike McDaniel gets the ball into the hands of the guys that he wants to get the ball in the hands to, you'd expect Waddle's volume to really boost in that scenario. Again, that's why I say it's the clearest contingency-based argument. And he's already good enough, I think, to justify his cost, even if Hill's on the field. He was still very good, was my point. Even with Hill being even better, people get so caught up in the number one, number two stuff. So anyway, the point, though, with the Waddle hype is both of those guys, tons of volume, not a lot of room for a number three. I think that's Jonnu Smith can probably be the pretty clear number three. There's not a lot of competition, but I think that's an issue for his true upside. The other guy that's kind of – go ahead.
I want to say that the New England Patriots once signed Jonnu Smith to a 4-year, $50 million contract.
Yeah, that did happen.
$30 million was guaranteed. And then last year, Arthur Smith proved that Jonnu Smith is good. Just Bill Belichick can't coach. So now that you have Smith in a good offense, shouldn't he be all in? It seems like you're soft pedaling this.
I guess. The other guy that is sort of intriguing, not because he moved, but Noah Fant. We've always wanted to run enough routes. He was a part-time, didn't run enough routes in Denver, didn't run enough routes in Seattle. His numbers, unfortunately, waned quite a bit last year, and they added Jackson Smith and Jigba, who's back, and you have three receivers that are all very good. So I don't know that there's going to be a lot of volume available for Noah Fant either, but he has had his routes limited in Seattle as well. And now you have a new staff. You have Disley and Colby Parkinson, the other two tight ends that ran a lot of routes, both gone to the Chargers and the Rams. Maybe Fant finally runs 450 routes in a season and could be a little bit intriguing. Although, again, tough for him to get enough target volume. But yeah, couple tight end moves that are at least worth noting and discussing. These are names that have been interesting names in the past. Again, it pains me, but of those three guys, the one that I think is most relevant is Zach Ertz. No,
don't do that to us. Noah Fant, 48% routes last year, 9.6 yards per target. Did either Fant's agent or the other 31 NFL teams realize that he was available? I mean, what are you doing? Come on. Again, new offensive coordinator. We discussed that a little bit. That is exciting, but you still have the congestion there with those three receivers. You still have the quarterback in place. Ben, it's so fun to discuss all of these moves with you. This has been an absolute blast this week. This is our third show. We'll see, kind of what else we do in the very near term going forward. There are going to still be some more moves. By the time you listen to this, a little bit of it could potentially be outdated, but it has been one of my favorites. I hope you've enjoyed. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Signals. Join us over at RotoViz. Leave us a rating and review. We'd really love that. We'll talk to you guys soon. We love you.